Zelda dungeons are really hard to make. And I think people who don't have game design experience probably underestimate generally how hard these are to make, because I don't think almost any other company in the game industry could successfully make Zelda dungeons. They are enormous investments of time and resources on Nintendo's part. My guess is that a given dungeon designer on a Zelda game probably only works on like 2 dungeons over the course of years. And they probably have teams of artists and engineers that are helping them out the whole time. I'm guessing a dungeon in a Zelda game is kind of comparable in scope to like a Destiny raid, which is a huge undertaking at our company.
Wow, that's a very interesting line to draw between
that
two.
I was about to say the same thing.
I've done a lot of raiding in Destiny, and I've played a lot of dungeons in Zelda, and I've never thought of them in the same way before, but I am now, and that's fascinating.
Yeah, I kind of when I first made that connection, I was like, "Is this really true?" And I think it might be. Obviously, I don't have a total view into their development process, but anyway, so lots of effort, and they kind of do this thing where they build these interconnected puzzles where stuff you do in one room can affect the state of things in another room, which is pretty unique. Not many other games do that, and they also do it while teaching the player the mechanics of the dungeon. One of the hardest things to do in game design is basically what we call it on-ramping. Ramping a player on to a new mechanic or a new concept that they haven't encountered before. Or making them look at an old concept in a new way. And designing the pacing of a dungeon so that it gradually introduces players to these new concepts or new mechanics in a way where like, oh, the first time they encounter it, it's kind of their hand is held in some subtle way, like maybe the camera is panning so that it gives you a view of something at the same time another thing is giving you a hint about it. Like they do all this stuff that's pretty subtle to try to get you to like take these steps one at a time to learn how a mechanic works. So that's a normal Zelda dungeon. A thing that is pretty rare in Zelda dungeons, because it's an extra dimension that is even harder to balance on top of all that, is most Zelda dungeons they don't really make sense as actual places in the game world, right? You don't look at a Zelda dungeon, you're like, oh yeah, this is the kitchen, this is the dormitory. Like, I understand the function of the space in a narrative way.
You don't,
right? They're just kind of like random rooms.
You don't understand the real world function of Ocarina of Time's water temple?
Exactly. And then every once in a while they drop a dungeon where it's like this, on top of doing all those other things that are really hard that Zelda dungeons alone do, they also made it work as a functional space. The Snow Peak Temple, whatever it's called.
Yeah.
Snow Peak in Twilight Princess is an example of this. And in Skyward Sword, the Sand Ship is an example of this. The space all makes sense. You know the function of it, and I find that just the fact that they managed to build unique and interesting puzzle design on top of that, or in parallel with that, I should say, is just a really impressive feat of game design.
Max, I'm going to start with you. Do you prefer Breath of the Wild's sensibility around dungeon versus Skyward Sword's, or vice versa? And where do you think the series should go from here?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Because, first of all, I think I prefer Skyward Swords as like standalone experiences. If someone was going to be like, we're going to hand you a controller, Max, you're going to play either a Skyward Sword dungeon or a Breath of the Wild dungeon, I would say Skyward Sword. No questions. Other than who are you and how are you creating the scenario? But
right,
I
exactly.
don't know that I think you can transplant a Skyward Sword style dungeon into Breath of the Wild and have it work very well. Skyward Sword has this entire philosophy where they wanted they wanted to be very sandbox driven. They wanted it to be a game where like you can solve every problem multiple ways. You have a lot of freedom in the order that you solve problems, or whether to solve them at all. Like, right? There's almost nothing in Skyward Sword, nothing in Breath of the Wild that's really required. literally nothing, I guess, except for defeating Ganondorf at the end. So those are kind of major design pillars of Breath of the Wild. But Skyward Sword dungeons, and really classic Zelda dungeons at all, don't really work with those pillars. Puzzles generally have a single solution. They're intricately designed around whatever that solution is. There's usually an order that you go through them in. I talked in the last episode about how Zelda dungeons have this. They teach you the mechanics of the dungeon by exposing you to them in like a very intentional order, so that you get used to them, and you find it first in like a simple version, and then they start expressing it in more complicated ways as you go through the dungeon. And that pretty much requires a linear order to do it that way. So what we see in Breath of the Wild is a weird compromise, right? Like they sort of they turned off your wall climbing for one thing. They turned off like a major mechanic of the game to try to like limit you a little bit, right? To try to to shunt you down these more predetermined paths. But they also sort of tried to keep some of the sandboxiness, because it would have been really jarring to go from the overworld play of Breath of the Wild to a classic dungeon that had no sandbox play at all. They did have an example of what I consider a possible future for dungeons in Breath of the Wild, which was Hyrule Castle. Hyrule Castle felt like a big experiment to me. It was they were trying to make something that was both felt kind of like a dungeon, where it was like cavernous interior labyrinthine space with cool stuff to discover, while also having the same kind of sense of freedom and being able to solve problems in different ways that the overworld had.